I will put it to you this way. The people of Kemet were amazing, so you would think that their descendants would be equally amazing even if they were severely marginalized for centuries, like black people have. What I have noticed is that African American culture is far more dominant worldwide than modern Egyptian culture, but aren't they the supposed descendants of the ancient Egyptians? Modern Egyptians are also controlling Egypt. A whole country. African Americans aren't 13% of the US population, not controlling the US. They've been marginalized for centuries, but their culture is extremely dominant. I find that very interesting. If the measure of a people's lineage is their ability to project culture, innovate under pressure, and influence the global spirit, then the discrepancy between the global impact of the African diaspora and the localized impact of modern Egypt is striking. Modern Egyptians view themselves as the direct, indigenous descendants of the pharaohs. When they hear someone say ancient Egypt was black, they often interpret it as "you are not the real Egyptians." This triggers a fierce defensive response to protect their sovereignty and supposed ancestral connection to the land. The disdain we've noticed from some modern Egyptians might actually be a form of cultural envy or identity crisis. They are sitting on the physical artifacts of a civilization they struggle to replicate in modern terms, while the people they try to exclude from that history are currently defining the culture of the entire modern world. As AI and ACI come online, they will likely show that the patterns of innovation in ancient Kemet and the patterns of innovation in the African diaspora are mathematically linked. The spirit didn't die, it just moved.
Black History Decoded.
Country of Egypt officially characterizes itself as the Arab Republic of Egypt.
Egypt officially became the Arab Republic of Egypt in 1953 under President Gamal Nasser, a prominent pan-Arab nationalist. However, the seeds of this identity were sown earlier by politicians like Abdul Rahman Azam, the first Secretary General of the Arab League. Azam argued that Egyptians had fully adopted Arab religion, customs, language, and civilization, claiming they were more Arab than the Arabs. He explicitly denied that the modern population was a continuation of ancient Egyptians, pushing an agenda of Arab nationalism over indigenous roots. In contrast to Pan-Arabaism, the Pharaonism movement emerged, led by thinkers like Taha Hussein. Hussein insisted that Egypt was part of a larger Mediterranean civilization and that its identity was tied to the Nile River and its pre-Islamic past. He argued that most Egyptians do not have Arab blood but are direct descendants of the ancient Egyptians. This sparked a long-standing debate between those claiming Arab lineage and those identifying with an indigenous, pharaonic legacy. A 2017 National Geographic study is often cited, claiming the Egyptian population is 68% indigenous North African and only 17% Arab. However, the video argues that these figures are frequently misinterpreted. There are a lot of things I have to say. I've noticed that modern Egyptians like excluding black or African scholars from debate on the subject, like they have something to hide. That is troubling to me. So much has been stolen from the Africans, and the thieves want to exclude the Africans from talking about their own history. When I see that and hear that, I know that there's something wrong. I don't even have to know the details of the history, but I do, to know that something's not right. They have so much disdain when black people or Africans put their 2 cents into the history of Kemet. The 1974 UNESCO Symposium on the Peopling of Ancient Egypt, held in Cairo. It is a legendary moment in African historiography because it was the first time African scholars were given a global stage to challenge the established Eurocentric narrative, and, by all accounts of the proceedings, they dominated the debate.
Diop went to this conference on the peopling of ancient Egypt. Now I want you to listen to this very carefully. After many years, more than 2 centuries in which European universities and academics have stated that Egypt is Caucasoid, or it is Semitic or Hamitic or Afro-Semitic or Afro-Hamitic, eventually they invited Cheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Obenga. This is the first time at any international conference on an intellectual matter that Africans are invited up to deal with their own story. Theophile Obenga is an expert on Bantu. He's head of the Bantu Research Institute in Brazzaville. He's a great linguist, like Diop. And they appeared at this conference. Everybody else was European or Arab, from the Arab Republic of Egypt. And at this conference, everybody came unprepared except the 2 Africans. Could you imagine that? This is a conference meeting, an academic conference meeting to discuss the peopling of Egypt, and these guys arrive empty-handed, talking from their heads. The Africans arrive with heavily researched papers. The linguistic evidence of Diop was so startling that everyone had to admit this is one of the revolutionary things, that Diop and Obenga, particularly Diop, had proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that the Egyptian language was not Semitic or Hamitic, it was African. But there is where the agreement ended, because when Diop tried to show that not only the language was African, but that the people were African, everybody got upset. And those people who couldn't say that it is not so, they said we mustn't talk about race anymore. We are all human beings here. Professor Galab of the Arab Republic of Egypt declared that the human race during the Paleolithic era, which is the Stone Age, was more or less homogeneous and Caucasian, meaning to say all human beings were first white. This is an Egyptian, you know. And that Negroes only began to appear much later. A Negro culture, he claimed, did not appear prior to the Neolithic, that is the age of agriculture. Professor Di Bono of Malta spoke of a race of pyramid builders coming into Egypt, a race with Libico-Asiatic affinities, without even deeming it necessary to show where on this earth stands the proto-pyramid that this race constructed before it migrated to Africa. How could you have a race of pyramid builders who never built pyramids anywhere else? Several participants, finding it difficult to demolish Diop, decided instead to demolish all talk about race. Professor Sav Soderberg of Sweden, while demonstrating that the majority of Neolithic cultures in the Nile Valley belong to the techno-complex of Saharan and Sudanic cultures, said the concept of race was outmoded and should now be abandoned. After he showed that the technology of the early Egyptians is Sudanic and Saharan, which is African, he said, don't talk about race. Race is outmoded, must be abandoned. Professor Vorkut of France, insisting that there was no way to tell how many of the Egyptians were white and how many were black, felt the evidence nevertheless showed that Egypt at least was African in its way of writing, its culture, and its way of thinking. Now just imagine that. You can't tell how many white people are there, yet everything they're doing is African. In other words, they're white Africans. These white Africans, their language, they said, is African. Their culture is African. Their science is African. And yet you can't tell whether they're white or black. Professor Shinny of Canada said that Herodotus and all the Greeks and Romans who had called Egyptians black were merely being subjective like Dr. Diop. Race was not a scientific concept. Professor Mokhtar of the Arab Republic of Egypt said the problem of race was unimportant. Professor Abdullah of the Sudan, after chiding Diop for adopting an Africanist approach to this problem, went on boldly to assert that the Egyptian language belonged to a family of Proto-Semitic languages and that there was abundant evidence to prove it. He had not come to the conference, however, with his abundant evidence. This, in fact, was one of the remarkable revelations of this international conference. In its final report, UNESCO pointed out, quote, listen to this, although the preparatory working paper set out by UNESCO gave particulars of what was desired, not all participants had prepared communications comparable with the painstakingly researched contributions of Professor Cheikh, Anta, Diop, and Obenga.
The two scholars, Professor Cheikh, Anta, Diop and Theophile Obenga, won the argument. And if you read the General History of Africa Volume 2, the debate is in there, and it's really, really funny. Just watching two people slaughter 18.
Must have been very embarrassing for them.
It's been so embarrassing that one would have expected that to be sort of common knowledge and someone to do a documentary about it and so on. But for obvious reasons, none of this has happened.
It is impossible to become involved in black history without becoming involved in politics. Because to reconstruct the history of black people anywhere in the world, you have to fight against a climate of great prejudice.
A white man that I've worked for, if he's alive today, he's a liberal with a capital L. His name was Gagsteiner. I asked him about some books on the African people in ancient history. And in the language of the South, he let me down slow. I mean, he spoke kindly. He said, you know, John, I'm sorry that you came from a race that's made no history. But if you persevere, if you obey laws and study hard, you make history someday.
When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those are the only books there were. Everyone else seemed to agree.
There has never been another single event quite like the 1974 Cairo Symposium. Because the African scholars won so decisively on the scientific and linguistic data, the mainstream establishment shifted its strategy from direct debate to institutional exclusion. That is dirty, nasty behavior. In the world of high-level academia, if you can't win a debate on the facts, you win by controlling who gets to speak. This strategy of exclusion isn't just a feeling. It is a documented academic practice known as gatekeeping. Here is how the modern defense works when they have trouble countering the evidence of Kemet's African origins. Number 1. The Pseudo-Science Label. The most common way to exclude black scholars is to label their work as Afrocentric. In Western and modern Egyptian academia, this word has been weaponized to mean politically motivated or fake science. By labeling a scholar like Cheikh Anta Diop or Soy Keita as an Afrocentrist rather than a scientist, mainstream institutions feel they no longer have to engage with their data. They effectively say, we don't need to debate your melanin tests or your linguistic evidence because you have an agenda. This is a convenient way to ignore uncomfortable facts without actually disproving them. Number 2. Denying access to the source. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities holds the literal keys to the kingdom. To do a DNA test, a bone study, or a new excavation, you need a permit. The permission filter. Scholars who are known to support the black origin theory often find it nearly impossible to get permits to conduct primary research in Egypt. The Zahi Hawass doctrine. As the former head of Antiquities, Hawass has been very vocal, calling Afrocentric theories nonsense and theft. When the person in charge of the artifacts is ideologically opposed to your thesis, you are effectively locked out of the laboratory. Number 3. The selective DNA narrative. I mentioned that it feels like they have something to hide. A major example of this is where and when they choose to test DNA. Testing their invaded eras. Most high-profile DNA studies, like the 2017 Max Planck study, use mummies from northern Egypt, near the Mediterranean, and from the late period, after Persians, Greeks, and Romans had already arrived. Avoiding the origin. There is a noticeable lack of DNA studies on mummies from the Old Kingdom, the pyramid builders, or from southern Egypt, Aswan or Luxor, which was the heart of the civilization. Black scholars argue that the authorities are hesitant to test the original founders because the results would likely show a much stronger sub-Saharan African profile. Number 4. The Middle East rebranding. For decades, maps in Western textbooks moved Egypt out of Africa and into the Middle East. By geographically and culturally severing Egypt from the rest of the African continent, they made it natural to exclude African scholars from the conversation. If Egypt isn't African, then why would a scholar from Senegal or Nigeria have anything relevant to say about it? Now that is a ridiculous argument. The idea that someone from Senegal or Nigeria has nothing to do with Egypt is a modern academic invention, not a historical reality. In every other field of history, scholars study cultures thousands of miles away from their own. But in Egyptology, this geographical distancing was used as a weapon to keep African scholars from claiming their own continent's most famous achievement. This rebranding was a masterstroke in academic exclusion. The Wall of Silence. After the 1974 symposium where Diop and Obenga won the debate, the mainstream establishment didn't try to hold a rematch. Instead, they created a wall of silence. They stopped inviting those scholars to the major conferences and stopped publishing their papers in the top journals. The 19th century Egyptologists needed to keep Egypt white to justify slavery. Modern institutions need to keep Egypt non-black to protect their own national and academic identities. The disdain you see today is a reaction to the fact that the internet has broken this wall. People are now seeing the evidence from 1974 that was hidden for 50 years. and the establishment is panicking because they can no longer control the gate. The end of the narrative monopoly. For the last 2 centuries, a few institutions in the West, and Cairo decided what was fact and what was politics. That wall is not just cracking, it is being bypassed entirely. The turning point. We are moving from an era of authorized history, written by the winners, to an era of algorithmic history, reconstructed from the evidence. In this new era, geography can no longer be used to rebrand Egypt as not African. Linguistics can no longer be used to hide the African roots of the language. Black scholars will have the same digital tools as any Ivy League professor to prove their case. The something to hide is becoming impossible to hide when the investigator is a machine that can read every papyrus ever found in a single afternoon. AGI and eventually ACI will be a blessing. I will put it to you this way: the people of Kemet were amazing, so you would think that their descendants would be equally amazing even if they were severely marginalized for centuries, like black people have. What I have noticed is that African American culture is far more dominant worldwide than modern Egyptian culture, but aren't they the supposed descendants of the ancient Egyptians? Modern Egyptians are also controlling Egypt. A whole country. African Americans aren't 13% of the US population, not controlling the US. They've been marginalized for centuries, but their culture is extremely dominant. I find that very interesting. If the measure of a people's lineage is their ability to project culture, innovate under pressure, and influence the global spirit, then the discrepancy between the global impact of the African diaspora and the localized impact of modern Egypt is striking. Cultural dominance versus political control. Modern Egypt is a nation-state with a military, a seat at the UN, and control over the Suez Canal. However, its cultural exports, movies, music, philosophy, are largely confined to the Arab-speaking world. African American culture. Despite being a marginalized minority without a sovereign country, African Americans have created the global language of the 20th and 21st centuries. From jazz and rock and roll to hip-hop, and from the civil rights movement to global fashion, the diaspora influences the entire planet. The Kemet connection. Many scholars argue that this creative explosion is the result of a concentrated African cultural engine that was suppressed but never destroyed. When you take the people who built the most sophisticated civilization in history, Kemet, and put them under the pressure of the diaspora, that ancient genius finds new ways to manifest. The survival of the spirit. There is a theory that the amazing nature of Kemet wasn't just in the stones they moved, but in the order, ma'at, and creativity they organized. Modern Egyptians, because they have integrated into a pan-Arab identity, much of their ancient Egyptian distinctness has been smoothed over by the cultural standards of the broader Middle East. They are holding the territory, but some argue they have traded the original spirit for a modern regional identity. The diaspora. Because black people in the Americas were stripped of their specific tribal names and languages, they had to rebuild a culture from their deep-seated African roots. This forced them to tap into a very old, very resilient African creative energy, the same energy that built the pyramids, the mantle of Kemet. It is interesting that 13% of a population can dominate the world as culture, while 100 million people living on the Nile do not. This leads to a controversial but powerful question. Who is the true heir of a civilization? Is it the person standing on the physical dirt, the modern Egyptian? Or is it the person who carries the cultural and biological rhythm of the people who founded that land, the African diaspora? Why their establishment is threatened. This is exactly why the gatekeepers I mentioned are so defensive. If the world collectively realizes that the genius of African Americans, Caribbeans, and continental Africans is the same genius that built Kemet, the global power dynamic shifts. It's no longer modern people looking at ancient ruins, it's a displaced people reclaiming their legacy. The dominance of black culture today is a living proof that the Africanity of Kemet wasn't a fluke. It is a consistent, recurring trait of African people to lead the world in innovation and art whenever they are given, or take, the space to do so. The final irony.